this whole business about the hyperactivity of a lateral pterygoid, as if that has been our opponent. This intense lateral pterygoid activity, this hyperactivity, it's just trying to do its job. Let's take a look at what that thing is really trying to do this whole time. So there would be a temporalis muscle, and as you see that there's occluding teeth, you go, wait a minute, that thing shouldn't be dark like that. It really is an activity. I still see occluding teeth as an activity of the musculature. It's easy to determine and to see and to watch and to measure maximum contraction of a temporalis muscle. Oh, by the way, I want to address this real quickly. I look at some of the images I make. Some of these are 12 or 15 years ago, maybe even longer. And I wish I had drawn all these little lines appropriately in their right orientation. Because a muscle can only get shorter, and the direction of that fiber dictates where the attachment is going to get pulled to. So this is inaccurate. Most of these fibers go this way. The anterior temporalis resides in a very deep depression in the anterior fossa here. It's a really thick, meaty muscle. We don't know that. You could bounce back here to the posterior temporalis, which is kind of thin. And you know what a posterior temporalis can do? Get shorter. That's all a muscle can do. And a posterior temporalis attaches to the coronoid process. And why would you need a muscle that pulls a coronoid backwards? After you protrude, how do you retrude? Posterior temporalis. What else? Okay. Most of the temporalis, the real action is in the anterior segment. So let's talk about the lateral pterygoid. If it were to contract at maximum, the elevators would have to allow it to do so. And I don't really think we ever see anyone with a problem of hyperactivity of the lateral pterygoid, because they'd have their mouth chin forward all the time, or with their digaster, they'd be open all the time. There is no such thing as a, all by itself, hyperactive lateral pterygoid. So how can I demonstrate, how can a lateral pterygoid get fatigued? What's really fun is, you guys can't see yourselves, but I can. It's fun to watch people going, practicing. There's the hyperactive lateral pterygoid, if you want to call it that way. How can I fatigue that muscle? I need to provide resistance. Anyone who wants to work out a muscle needs resistance. How can I resist that advancement and opening of the mandible? I can hold it closed, and that lateral pterygoid is still contracting in there. Here's the one time I've got occluding that's not the fault of the elevator. It's this clamp that's holding this jaw shut. Now this lateral pterygoid is working really, really hard. And we're used to seeing teeth together all the time. We stipulate they're together all the time. We stipulate the occlusion. And Barry Glassman would talk on the internet about, well, you're stipulating the occlusion. I go, what are you talking about? That sounds so weird to say. But we know what we're thinking. It's the occluding is what is happening all the time that we have stipulated. We call it the occlusion. We seem to start from that position. But still, I keep talking about a resistance to reopening. With this lateral pterygoid, it's a resistance to reopening. And I can remember Barry Glassman saying to me, look, Jim, just because dentistry starts or stipulates at closed, that's what we think about. Resistance to reopening, my Jim Boydian term, doesn't make sense. I understood what I was talking about. Barry got it. He goes, no, they don't get what you mean. Resistance to reopening? You need a term that they understand. How about resistance to movement? I thought about that. Why did that word make sense in dentistry? Because we call them functional movements. Quick, what's a functional movement? Protrusive, excursive. When's it? During mastication? No. After you're closed and you move sideways and you rub your teeth together, that's an excursive movement in dentistry. We call it a functional movement. There's no function there. There's no purpose. I like to take the word function and forget it. I like to call it purposeful. What are the purposeful movements of mastication? Any monkey knows that. We don't care. No one seems to be missing meals in our field. What are they doing when their teeth are together? They're parafunctional movements. and there's resistance to movement, and the resistance is felt by the lateral pterygoid that's trying to move or open or disclude these teeth. Here's an example that I just tried this past week. It's how to show yourself what a fatigued, sore lateral pterygoid must feel like to your patient. If you open your jaw slightly, keep your teeth apart, and do not let your jaw move at all, and rest your fist against your jaw, and press your fist against your jaw, but do not let your jaw move at all, the opposite lateral pterygoid will resist you and hold your jaw from being pushed off to the side. Push a little bit harder, and your lateral pterygoid is now going to strain and work a little bit harder. If you push really hard, you will get the strangest sensation and pressure under your eye. And I've done it, and I get a headache for about a half an hour after. I hate doing it. When you're by yourself, open your jaw a little bit and push like crazy as hard as you can. And you almost will resist pushing because the feeling is so strange. That is the resistance to the lateral pterygoid. Now, normally, the contracting lateral pterygoid would advance that mandible, and there isn't resistance at all. It's an easy thing to do. Opening your jaw or protruding your mandible is not hard to do. There's never any resistance there for it. Here is a purposeless unilateral movement. There are no teeth occluding in this example. And so this lateral pterygoid, when it contracts independently, not all of the fibers are needed to contract. I only have 4 lines there, so I made 2 of them sort of light up. Here's an unresisted attempt by the lateral pterygoid to advance its condyle. Now, if we want to create a point of contact, a contact isn't a thing, it's the result of an activity. So here's a temporalis that's contracting and elevating the mandible, causing a contact that we're now representing over here. So that contact is the function of the contracting temporalis. As the lateral pterygoid now begins to contract, it encounters the resistance. If it increases its contraction, it could break that contact. Sort of like what grinding is all about, as you break contacts and move these teeth across each other. So here's a lateral pterygoid encountering resistance and then moving the mandible from these occluding teeth. So the degree of the occluding resistance, it's a function of the clenching intensity. And that dictates how intense the lateral pterygoid is contracting. There isn't any food that wears out a lateral pterygoid. That's for the elevators. This is unoccluding the teeth if someone keeps occluding them. Let's increase the degree of contraction of the elevator and make that a stronger, heavier, I don't want to say heavier, it's like a bigger piece of blue paper. It's just a more intense holding together of these teeth. We're going to intensify the degree of contact. So now when this lateral pterygoid contracts, it can't break that contact apart. It's met with a static resistance. It can't move the mandible at all. Because this mandible is sort of a horseshoe shape, it now allows a little bit of contortion to happen in the mandible. And the force vector is always at the point of resistance. So now you have a cross the arch, medially directed force at that most distal contact. That is a fantastic way to wipe out a joint. So when we talk about, well, you don't want a unilateral distal interference, that would be really bad. Well, why? Here's why we don't like these unilateral distal interferences. It's the opposite side condyle that can get strained. And in dentistry, we even have an adorable term for this. It is one of the TMD Da Vinci Code stellar. As if it's a good thing, we call that posterior support for the joint. Do you have posterior support for the joint? What does that mean? If you really thought about how you support a joint, that with gravity is relaxed anyway. What are you trying to support? We think about, do you have support for your knee because you twisted it skiing? What kind of splint do you have on your knee? So we think about splints and joint support and all that kind of stuff. We call that posterior support for the joint, because if this lateral pterygoid tried to contract, nothing will happen. This condyle cannot be pulled medially because of this contact here, which I like this better term, posterior immobilization of the joint. I like that. Sometimes you don't want that condyle moving, you want strain. Well, if they're going to be closing, at least we can immobilize the joint. Let's borrow the elevator muscle in the posterior segment to immobilize that joint. It's not posterior support, that sounds like a good thing. This is posterior immobilization. I think that's the more accurate term. What if we move that contact to the incisors? So now this little dot here is much lighter because there's only 30% degree of elevator contraction intensity. And to move the mandible across an incisal contact doesn't take much more effort anymore. It's easier to do. There isn't as much resistance. You can't provide enough resistance to render this lateral pterygoid helpless. It will still move it. Because incisal contact only allows 30% maximum of elevator contraction intensity. And when you start making some NTIs someday, you'll go, look at that divot. Did a posterior contact cause hyperactivity of the elevators? There is no posterior contact. These people are still occluding. They're still closing. They're still moving side to side. They'll wear a divot into a discluding element, but at least they can move. That's an upper discluding element. Here's a lower NTI device, and this is where two centrals have moved side to side. Can you imagine putting a piece of plastic and only having your centrals scrape into plastic? You couldn't do that during the day to save your life. It's so creepy and weird and hard to do. People wake up and like, wow! I look at stuff like that and I try to imagine what it takes to make the kind of markings that people do in these devices, and it just boggles my mind. It's amazing.